So, we're going to talk a little bit about mood disorders tonight. I'm going to mesh together the presentations. I took some of Dr. Lindholm's slides since he wasn't able to be here, and I kind of mixed them in with mine. So you might see a few that they look a little different as it relates to the content, but I think it's still really good content, and he was planning on presenting it, and then I was going to kind of intermix some of my own things. So I hopefully slid everything in here in a way that it will make plenty of sense for you. So we're talking about the link between your brain and your mood, and I think a lot of people have an inherent knowledge that when we're dealing with a mood disorder, and we'll kind of define some of those things as we go through here, but we're talking a lot about depression, anxiety being kind of the main ones that we're aware of in our society today. But there's a significant brain connection there as it relates to the development of those disorders. And so what I hope to kind of give you an idea of tonight is going through some of the basic anatomy and physiology of how our brains work. We're not going to take to extreme depths because there's just a wealth of information as it relates to how our brains work. And I think the more we learn about how our brains work, the more we realize we don't know how our brains work. We have some good understandings, but the depth of complexity is just amazing. We're going to talk about this concept of neuroplasticity, which is just a really big kind of key word in our sciences these days as it relates to the development of the nervous system, even after we're grown. Mood disorders overview, so we'll just kind of give a brief kind of understanding of what those are, and then what are some approaches to supporting healthy brain function, and majority of that from a natural standpoint here, as we'll talk about that. So basic brain anatomy. We have different lobes of what we call the telencephalon, or which would be like the cortex. So this would be all these areas up and through here. So towards the front of the brain, we have the frontal lobe. Down here, we have the temporal lobes, which is kind of around the side. In the back area here, occipital lobe, and then this area in here would be the parietal lobes. And so we have those on both sides. Deep in the brain, there's some other aspects of anatomy that are also very important. We're not going to dive much into those tonight, but some aspects like the basal ganglia are deeper within the brain there. Some different areas of cortex that are within the deeper regions of the brains that we can't see on the outside or superficially. This little area right back here is called the cerebellum. And for chiropractors, this is very important to us because this is where a lot of the research and chiropractic and how it affects our overall health and our nervous system function. A lot of the pathways that we activate when we're doing adjustments are modulated and transduced through the cerebellum as they're on their way up to the other aspects of the cortex in the brain. And so the cerebellum is really important to us. And then the brainstem are these areas just in front of the cerebellum and below it. So we have the mesencephalon, the pons, and then the medulla towards the bottom. And so there's three different regions, and then there's different cranial nerves that live in those areas. Cranial nerves being more of what controls what's going on in our head, our face, as well as some of our vital functions through the autonomic nerve pathways. And so there's a lot packed in to this head of ours. It is quite amazing. And when we take those regions and we actually break them down to even their cellular structure, what we really look at is that our brains are made up of some different types of cells. The one we oftentimes hear a lot about is neurons. Neurons are going to be the cells that are actually taking and sending electrochemical signals through their cell bodies. Many of them originate in our brain and then transfer or travel through brainstem, spinal cord, spinal nerve, and there's some different stops along the way where they talk and they communicate to other branches of nerves. But we'll kind of be keeping our focus more just into the brain areas here as we're talking about that, not so much all the descending pathways. But there's roughly, and this is kind of mind-boggling, 86 to 100 billion is kind of the current estimates. And we have more generally as we're younger and we start to kind of prune and reduce some of these as we're growing and developing as children. And then as we get to adult years, early adult years is where we are kind of, our brain is kind of formed at that point, in our early 20s for the majority of us. And we've kind of lost a lot of these nerves. But what happens is, we'll talk about as we go through, there's a lot of connections that can still be made. We don't necessarily regrow a lot of neurons as we go through our life, but there's a lot of connections that can be made from these different branches. And you can see all these different branches coming off this aspect of the cell, and it's constantly reaching out to other nerve cells and forming all these interconnected pathways. Again, it's just amazing how God made us, how he put us together. It is mind-boggling. That would be amazing enough, but then we have all these other cells called neuroglia. And so there's oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells. These are all the ones in our brain. And then in our peripheral nervous system, we have Schwann cells. Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes are what's forming myelin, or a covering. So that's represented by this little purple cell here. And so it essentially forms an insulation like you would have around an electrical wire, so that you can send signals really fast. Because again, this is all electrical signals going through these nerve pathways. Amazing, you hearing me, me speaking, this is all electrical signals. Again, it's just amazing. We have these astrocytes. Astrocytes are what form a barrier between the circulatory system and the nerves, so that the neurons are very privileged in that they are not going to be exposed to everything in the blood. The astrocytes are actually going to block some of it, or they're going to allow certain aspects of it through. But what we've learned is astrocytes actually have a much bigger role than that as it relates to just keeping the neuron healthy. And it has a lot to do with even how these synapses, or these connections between nerves, function within our brain. And so again, we're not going to dive deep into that, but our understanding is growing of some of these other cells as well, and they're much more complex than we originally, even when I learned in school 15 years ago, when I graduated. Another really important cell is these microglia. Microglia are essentially part of like the immune system that exists within the brain and the central nervous system. And these cells kind of act like, almost like white blood cells would act in the periphery. They kind of have that similar function, where they're going to be working at helping to modulate inflammation. They're going to be helping if there's anything damaged, trying to help clean that up. They're also going to be responsible for producing inflammation, reacting to immune system compromises, those types of things. And so this is just a little bit bigger picture of that to kind of see again how this all works together. But imagine again, this is one neuron, and we're talking about 86 billion of these in our brain. It's just, again, it's amazing, it's mind-boggling. And there's certain concentrations of different areas where they're a little bit more dense, and then certain areas where they're a little bit less dense as well. So we kind of have a little bit of an idea of like what our brains look like, what they're made up of, but what is the brain actually there for? Primarily, it's there for survival of our bodies. Our bodies, it's kind of interesting when you get into this world of neurology and thinking about this, like there's some schools of thought that are like, well, our brains have bodies to get the brains from one place to the other, kind of thinking of like the supremacy or the singularity of the nervous system here. But it's really reliant on all the other systems in order for this to work well. But very, very much so, our brain is about survival of our bodies, but it's also about what makes us who we are, and we're, again, very privileged in how our brains work, in that we actually have more personality and we have more individuality than we would see expressed potentially in other animal species. One of the ways, and you're going to see me come back to this concept here, is sensory input comes in to our brain and motor information comes out of our brain. So that's kind of this bi-directional communication. We talk about this a lot in chiropractic. Sensory in, motor out. The majority of the output of our brain is actually inhibitory. It's actually suppressing unwanted things that would happen reflexogenically or just automatically within our bodies. And it's really quite amazing when you start looking at all the different systems. You think about something like our heart. It has a pacemaker and it just automatically beats at a certain rate, but it then is influenced by motor output from our brain to say, I either need to do more, I need to do less. But it's again kind of applying the gas or the brake to that reflexive system. Same things like our digestive system. We don't have to think, all right, I took a bite of food, now I need to digest it. It just happens automatically. But when we're not eating food, then some of those quiet down. We don't see as much activity in those nerve pathways. And so it works through activating and inhibiting different motor outputs for the body. So that's, again, kind of a big picture concept. I don't expect you to necessarily dive much deeper into than that. But these are some of those aspects of sensory function that we look at. So touch and pressure, taking and putting some pressure on your arm, you feel that. If you take and stretch your arm out, you feel that. Every time we move, even if we're not moving, there's this aspect of proprioception where our body is constantly being made aware of where we are at in space. And when we start to lose that, people start to lose their balance, they start to lose their equilibrium, those types of things. And there's a lot of things actually that we can lose as we start to lose perception of our body, because we really need that in order for it to function well. Sight or light input is another aspect of sensory function, that which comes in through our eyes. Smell, taste, hearing, all of these things are activated by receptors on nerves that then send information up to our brain. And so they can be used as actual inputs here, as we'll see later. And that's why I wanted to talk about these things right now. So just imagine all of these senses are constantly coming into your brain, and your brain is saying, do I need to respond to this? Or is this something I can just kind of let go by the wayside? You can smell something outside and you might hit your nose and you're like, that's no big deal. But you might smell smoke. That alerts you and makes you aware that there's something, and you need to pay attention. You need to apply consciousness to that. I talked about motor output. So we have skeletal muscle contraction, and then we have smooth muscle contraction. And skeletal muscle contraction would be like getting up and walking, or like doing a bicep curl, or just any sort of movement that we're talking about here. Smooth muscle contraction would be things that, again, are not under our volitional control for the most part. And so smooth muscles are our organ systems for the most part, is what we see. And some different types of endocrine secretions. But some people say that even cognition is an aspect of motor output. And so I put that underneath here as well. Okay. Neurotransmitters. This is something that we're not going to necessarily talk a lot about tonight, even though this is where a lot of depression and anxiety is geared towards, is looking at these neurotransmitters and trying to help with them. But I want to give you just kind of a basic understanding of what these are. They're essentially chemical signals that are released from one nerve cell to another, and they activate that nerve cell, the secondary nerve cell, in a specific way. So we kind of associate serotonin with like happy, feeling good. I feel like life is going well, and it kind of gives us that like pep in our step kind of a thought. But we also have things like norepinephrine, and this is another one. This is a catecholamine, and so it's oftentimes released in response to different types of situations where we're going to be in a little bit more of a stressful type of an event. We have things like dopamine, that is like your pleasure and reward type of thing, and some medications even work along these lines to help boost these levels up for dopamine. Acetylcholine is one you don't see so much necessarily like in depression and anxiety types of situations, because this is more of like your learning type of neurotransmitter. It's also released at the neuromuscular junction for muscle contractility. And then we have GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, kind of the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so that's going to be the thing that helps to kind of generally calm and causes an inhibition of some of that output from the brain. So again, just kind of a little brief overview of what some of those neurotransmitters are. So in this next section, I want to talk now about brain and neuroplasticity. The definition of this is essentially our brain or our nervous system, it has the ability to undergo functional and even structural changes based on changes in the environment. And we think about this especially in the range of this word here. I'm sorry this is so small, but it says adaptability. Essentially, are we able to adapt? Do we have resilience to stressors that we are experiencing? When I say stressor, I'm not necessarily referring to just like a mental stress, like having a hard day, but it can be a chemical stressor that we're exposed to. It can be an environmental stressor, like an allergen that we're exposed to. It can be exercise. Exercise can be a stressor. Movement can be a stressor. And so how do we adapt to that? And do we have the potential to make our bodies better because of that? Or is it damaging us and making us worse? So this is used a lot in learning, and we base this a lot on our experiences. It can be positive, and I kind of alluded to that a little bit already. It can enhance or make more efficient a desired activity, but we can also have negative plasticity, and kind of the general catch-all term for this would be a neurodegeneration type of concept. And we're not talking necessarily about neurodegenerative diseases, but there is a definite connection between depression and anxiety and seeing those things earlier in life and the development of neurodegenerative diseases later in life. And so it is kind of important to be aware of this, is a lot of times our brain health is a continuum, and maybe on one end of this we start to notice symptoms of depression and anxiety. Is this potentially going to turn into something worse down the road with regards to dementia types of conditions? When I think about neuroplasticity and just a lot of aspects of health in my mind, I think about this concept of building resilience and thinking about it as this almost like a scale. And I'll use this example a little bit more as we go through the rest of the night, so I just want to introduce it to you now as it relates to plasticity. But we can have positive plasticity, like I said, or negative plasticity. And essentially what we want to see in resilience is if we can start to load the scales on the aspects of things that will help to build resilience and make us better, as opposed to loading the scale to things that tilt us towards negative plasticity, we're going to generally be set up for a better quality of life as we continue to go through life. And that is as it relates to mood disorders, but really every aspect of our life and our function. And so I use the bigger arrow here to say we really want to load this side, and we want to try and minimize the things that are on this side, okay? What does plasticity require? A lot. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, because like I said, we're learning and growing in our understanding of this, but this is kind of catches a lot of the basics of what you need to be aware of. And what we generally need is we need fuel. Fuel essentially to power our cells, power our mitochondria, which are in our cells. Even our nerve cells all have this powerhouse that generates energy. And so we need fuel for that. We need activation, which is, we'll see here some examples of that here as we go on. We need good, adequate nutrition. That ties somewhat into fuel, but it also kind of is its own thing in and of itself. And then a healthy environment. And we'll talk just very briefly about metabolic factors. Unfortunately, what I'm probably gonna do here tonight in this presentation is I'm gonna give you a lot of things that you're like, oh, I'd love to know more about that. And I'm just gonna mention them. And so we can talk about it a little bit more at the end here if we need to, but hopefully I'll give you at least some things that kind of whet your appetite and give you an idea of what are some steps that I can take moving forward, okay? So when we talk about fuel, oxygen is a very important thing in our bodies. And I won't dive into a lot, but if you have any condition that's reducing the ability of your body to carry oxygen to your cells, it's going to be a detriment to your brain. And so there's different ways of trying to help drive that up. Glucose is kind of the thing that, like when I went through my program, we talked about fuel for delivery, we talked about glucose, we talked about oxygen. It was like those were the two things that you really need. Glucose is essentially just sugar that we get from our foods, and that's what is utilized within the mitochondria to drive energy producing cycles. But what we've also found is that ketones can be used in the brain, and sometimes the brain will actually preferentially use ketones over glucose. And so I'll mention a ketogenic diet here in a little bit as something that is potentially beneficial for people who are dealing with brain degenerative conditions and things of that nature. And just know that the brain can use ketones to make energy very efficiently. Activation is, I'll just say very simply here, I heard this a lot in chiropractic school. It said, if you don't use it, you will lose it. And that is true of our physical bodies, but it's also true of our mental capacities as well. And so this is all, again, derived from sensory inputs and motor outputs. And so activation really has to do with all those things we were talking about on previous slides about sensory regions. So touch, pressure, movement, stretch, proprioception. These are all things that activate your brain. Those are all sensory signals coming in. They're perceived different areas of the brain depending on what the stimulus is. And then there's going to potentially be a motor consequence or a motor output because of that. And what we really want in these situations is for this proper sensory input to drive more proper motor output as it relates to our mood, how it relates to our cognition, how it relates to our ability to move, because if we move, we have a better brain, is really what research is showing. So basic nutrition, food, let's just say that's the main way we get nutrition into our bodies. And I don't necessarily need to educate you on, we are well educated, I would say, knowing what good and bad foods are. We kind of know the things we should be eating, the things that we shouldn't be eating. But sometimes in people's circumstances, they can even have sensitivities or intolerances to foods that are quote unquote good, things that would be nutritive and healthy. And so sometimes people are forming inflammatory responses to food that are actually affecting their gastrointestinal tract, their digestive system, and that inflammation can actually have crossover effects and start to affect people's brains as well, and just multiple facets of our body. And so this is something that I just mentioned here. This could be a class in and of itself, just talking about sensitivities and allergies and intolerances, because it is that important. Like sometimes people will stop eating a certain food and all of a sudden their brain starts to work better, which is a pretty phenomenal thing. Nutrients, again, we're not going to dive into all of these, but just know that like the most imperative things for our brain to function well are essential fats. Like that's like the first and foremost. You hear about fish oil types of supplementations. Omega-3s are really important, omega-6, and there's this balance. You know, we get kind of stuck a lot of times in like there's this one that we need. It's really a whole complement of them we need. And so getting good healthy fats, because we talked about the lining around the cells, the oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells, those are all very lipid rich or fat rich, and that's what helps to insulate our nerves and keep them healthy. B vitamins are important for just pretty much everything, but especially energy production. They're using some neurotransmitter synthesis and things of that nature, same as trace minerals. Vitamin D is also super important. Just for every cell in the body has some affinity and reaction to vitamin D, and so we need to make sure those are at healthy levels in our body. We also want to maintain a healthy environment for our bodies, for our brains. And so what this means is ideally we want to avoid things like trauma, because trauma, whether it be physical or mental and emotional, is going to put us in a state where we are in more of a fight or flight mode, or we're in a healing crisis. And that's not going to be a good or healthy environment necessarily for our brain to be in. Now, sometimes we have to be in those, and that's where that building resilience is very important. But you know, having a physical or emotional trauma can definitely put somebody into a depressive event or an anxiety type of an event. Toxin exposure can be another thing that can affect the health of our environment, of our body. Sometimes these things are inhaled, sometimes they're on our skin, sometimes we're eating them. There's just so many places we can be exposed to them these days. It's a little scary if you dive into that a little bit more. And so sometimes it's not always, we want to try and minimize our toxic exposure, but we also need to make sure that our body can deal with our toxic exposures as well through biotransformation pathways in our liver and our kidneys and our digestive system to be able to eliminate toxins when we are exposed to them. And then there's several metabolic factors here. Immune system and inflammation is very important. Like this is a big buzzword in our world and our sciences these days. Inflammation is like literally, you name a disease, the inflammation is probably somewhat tied to that, if not the main culprit. And so if we can keep our immune system and our inflammation levels low, that's going to be very helpful. Blood sugar is also very important, especially as it relates to our brain, because the brain being as big as it is, you imagine it in comparison to the rest of our body. I believe that the number, they estimate about 20 to 22% of our resources right off of the aorta going through our circulatory system are going directly to our brain. That's how important it is that we get things up there. Blood sugar is one of those things. And so if blood sugar is fluctuating either too high or too low, we're going to have consequences of that. And a lot of times people notice, like if I don't eat, I get tired and lethargic and I need to go lay down, and I eat and I feel better. Or people are, they eat and then they feel tired afterwards. Both of those are opportunities to say, like, there's probably something in your blood sugar that's not as ideal. It may not be diabetes or reactive hypoglycemia, but it just may not be ideal, and that can be affecting brain function. Thyroid is a super important producer of hormones that, again, are going to be having some impact on our brain function. Really every cell of our body, again, reacts somewhat to thyroid. And so if there's imbalances in the thyroid, it will start to affect, like I said, widespread throughout the body, but the brain can definitely be a consequence of that. Same with adrenal hormones. Like I mentioned already, hepatic biotransformation being important in being able to get rid of toxins. Digestive system, again, this is like, each of these could be like an hour long, if not longer class. But the digestive system, I think I actually did do a class on one of these digestive system a number of years ago. And we talk about it being like the second brain because there's 100 million neurons. Now, not nearly, not billions, but there's still 100 million. And there's this really awesome nerve called the vagus nerve that's sending information from these digestive system structures up to the brain. and there's actually chemicals, and they think even microbes are traveling here and then sending different types of communication. And so it's just a really, really important system to keep healthy. And there's so many people that deal with digestive problems, sometimes because they have brain dysfunction, but sometimes because they actually have gut and digestive dysfunction. Just male-female hormones in general, again, important that's a whole nother thing. They're so complex, but they do have different receptor areas in the brain. And so lower levels of estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all those things have an impact on our brain function. And then a cardiovascular system, this will be the last one I say because I'm sure there's more, but cardiovascular, we talked about a little bit already. We got to get blood to our brain. And so if our heart is unhealthy or the plumbing of our body is unhealthy, getting oxygen and getting nutrients places, our brain is an area that can really suffer. And so we really want to try and optimize all of these things. And so you can see how keeping our brain healthy is a whole body experience. We're going to jump in here and talk a little bit about mood disorders. Hopefully I've kind of set the table a little bit for some of the things that we're going to talk about as it relates to mood disorders, and then also as it relates to the treatment, or how can we naturally set the body up for resilience. And so as we talk about mood disorders here, we're going to talk about what they are. There's depression, there's anxiety. One thing I want to say about depression is we're not psychologists or psychiatrists as chiropractors. There's a whole diagnostic manual that those people use that is related to the different types of depression that people can have, the different types of anxiety, the different types of bipolar. And it gets very, very complex. And so we're not necessarily in our field diagnosing or treating those things directly. What we're trying to, again, is give people opportunities for building resilience in those. And so I'll talk a little bit about the multidisciplinary approach here in a couple slides. But let's first talk about mood disorders. And essentially a definition of this is significant changes in mood that will have a negative effect on daily life, usually characterized with dysfunction in the area of the limbic system. And this is some of those areas I mentioned that were kind of deeper inside the brain. We don't see them from the outside, deeper within the brain. And there's some different structures we'll talk about here in a moment. Depression is generally a hypoactivity or a reduction in functioning of certain areas, especially within the prefrontal cortex. And then it's oftentimes paired with hyperactivity of the amygdala, which is also tied into anxiety, because this is hyperactivity of the amygdala is what they really tie into having an anxious event, and connects emotion and behavior. And so you can see how there's a little bit of layering. And so commonly we see patients come in and they have a diagnosis of both depression and anxiety kind of layered on top of one another. One of them may be a little more prevalent than the other, of course. So some of the brain regions involved, we mentioned the prefrontal cortex, but the prefrontal cortex is this area here in the areas of the front. And this is really what makes us different than all other species of animal. And that is, we have higher brain function, we have modulation, better modulation of our subcortical structures, we have critical thinking, planning, problem solving. Not to say that other species of animal don't have that, but we have something very special, again, God created, born within us in this prefrontal cortex. But when it starts to function abnormally, or it starts to decrease in its function or its ability to regulate a lot of these other areas, because this is how it works, there's a lot of nerve signal here to one area, signals back to another area, and there's all these connections. And so when one starts to decrease, like we talked about with the prefrontal cortex, it can start to affect how much is the cingulate then regulating our emotions and driving us towards more stress and anxiety types of responses. Or if we have a painful response, does that cause us to have a depression event, or does that cause us to have an anxiety event? The hypothalamus is an area, again, deeper in the brain that regulates some of our neuroendocrine responses, and that's a fancy way for saying how our nerves and hormones are integrating together and working together. And the hypothalamus is actually a really amazing thing. We won't talk about it any more than that, but just everything from different rhythms in our body, hormonal rhythms, and even like light rhythms and things like that, like exposure to light and how that sets our circadian clocks and things like that. It's a really cool structure. Again, we know a lot about it, but there's more that I think we're going to learn as time goes on. Amygdala, we mentioned a little bit already as it relates to depression and anxiety, because it's that fear and anxiety response. And you may even hear this because it's kind of a common buzzword in people who are dealing with stress, anxiety. And so you're like, you're in your amygdala right now. And that essentially means that your prefrontal cortex is not inhibiting that, and so you're just kind of living in the anxiety, as opposed to being able to turn that prefrontal cortex on and start to calm some of that. But it pushes us into that irrational emotion, that irrational behavior when that is very active. And the basal ganglia kind of works in loops with all of this to either activate or inhibit. And a lot of that input comes from our prefrontal cortex and different areas of our prefrontal cortex. Our hippocampus is really tied into memory, and so we can have a memory of something, and it can literally then cause us to have a stress or an anxiety response. And again, it's amazing because we need that to some degree. You could be like, I'm in this situation, I've been in this situation before. Last time I was here, something bad happened, and so you can know I need to get out of it, but it kind of puts some of that fear, that stress into you. So that hippocampus ties in. And where neuroplasticity comes into this is we can have, again, positive neuroplasticity that can drive us towards improvement of these and having good higher cortical regulation of our limbic structures. Or we can have this concept of what we call wind up or escape, where sometimes something like the amygdala will be the example of, like, if it becomes really effective and very functional because we fire it off all the time because we're constantly under stress and we're always anxious, and the chemical makeup of our body, maybe because of our blood sugar and our thyroid is off, and so it's just all these different factors. Again, we kind of talk about this of tilting the balance towards plasticity, towards poor plasticity, away from good plasticity. And so that can happen, and we start to then reinforce this pathway, and it becomes more efficient, it becomes stronger. And that is the exact opposite of what we want. We want to be able to have control of these different facets and aspects. So this is a slide I threw in here from Dr. Lindholm, and I think it's kind of interesting to see that this is a study that was done as of 2022, and it said approximately 23.1 of US adults experience mental illness, including anxiety and depression. And another study that I didn't reference in here, but that was part of a class that I attended, said that they're expecting depression to be essentially like the number 2 cause of not mortality, but like starting to affect people's lives, and morbidity as they refer to it. And so like cardiovascular disease is probably going to continue to be number 1, that and cancer, but they think that mood disorders, depression specifically, is going to overtake and become number 2 here very quickly. And it's just that you see this is almost 1 out of 4. And I think that, again, this might be a little bit old, but I think it's like 1 out of 10 people are taking an antidepressant in the United States, which is, that's a lot of people when you think about it. 16.5% of adults in the US taking prescription medication, there you go, for mental illness within the last year. The percentage vary by demographics, women more than men generally. And I remember when Dr. Lindholm did a little brief synopsis of this, he said, usually because women are more willing to go to the doctor than men are. There's probably some truth to that. One of the things though, and this is stuff that is very known, even in the medical literature, is that antidepressants are not necessarily working better than placebo. And there's actually some studies that have been done about studies. And this is just the way our healthcare system works, is that they've literally studied the studies that said, like, oh yeah, this medication is really good and it's effective. And then people come back and they look at those critically and they're like, you massaged the numbers? you took these people out. There's just a lot of ways that they can make a study look better than it really is. I'll just kind of leave it at that. And so these drugs then come on the market, and they come with a long list of potential side effects. And I think about, and I don't watch much TV anymore, but I do remember, you hear about, whatever the new medication is that's out there, and it's a minute-long commercial, and 40 seconds of the commercial are about the potential side effects that you might have. But interestingly enough, some of the side effects of taking an antidepressant are worsening depression, self-harm, violence, and suicide. I didn't put it up, or Dr. Lindholm didn't put it on here, but another one is sexual dysfunction. That's like, I'm pretty sure the top one that you look at with all these antidepressants, that's the thing. And again, it's just, that's a very important thing. That's a very, like I said, a common symptom that people deal with. And yeah, it just really puts people into an even worse mood. Obviously with having some of that and worse mental health and mental function. So again, this is just kind of That's a very short list of the potential side effects. If you were to go look at it, there's quite a few more. And like I said, I think those are probably some of the more common ones. So when we look at a mood disorder, from our standpoint as chiropractors, we want to know, is this a mood disorder that is because of a psychological type of a trigger or a psychological type of condition, or is there something potentially physiological? Physiological is everything we've kind of talked about as it relates to the nervous system and keeping the nervous system healthy. There's going to be things that happen to us in life, and we're going to see here in a couple slides, and they can be what I'll just call generally stressors. They can be a divorce, loss of a loved one, wars, natural disaster, all these things. It's common for people, or injury, I mentioned that earlier, having some sort of a physical injury. All of those things are like, okay, you're probably going to have some depression after this. You might have some anxiety after this because of something that you experienced in the world. And so that's going to be more along the lines of like, okay, we need a psychological approach. Really, honestly, what we oftentimes need in these is a multidisciplinary approach. And I told you I would get to this. And so that means that there's a lot of people that can potentially be involved in a healthcare condition, like depression and anxiety. And a counselor can be one of them, or a psychologist, psychiatrist. Sometimes we do need medication for extreme forms, and even for like initial treatments of some of the lesser forms. Sometimes we need a functional medicine provider who can look through a lot of the things that I've mentioned to you already as it relates to blood sugar and thyroid and hormones and all of that. Can they do some labs to say this is where this person is at physiologically and what can we do to try and help out? As you'll see here, chiropractically, we really talk about driving nerve receptors as it relates to proprioception. That would be the perception of our body and awareness of our muscles, our tendons, our ligaments, our bone positions. And all of those all tie into more this physiological aspect of what can lead or contribute to depression and anxiety. So that's where I said, if you're coming and you're like, I'm only going to see you as my doctor and I want you to treat my depression and anxiety, I'm like, that's not the kind of game I play. Like, we need to have people who are specialized in their various aspects, because I'm not great at functional medicine. I need people who can help me with that. I definitely am not a counselor. I've tried a few times with people and it failed miserably. And so I learned over the years, you don't take that role on. That's not what my training is in. And so there's different facets that need to be addressed by other aspects of healthcare, and that's why they're there. Just real briefly, traditional schools of thought, we mentioned already, like everybody's heard like serotonin, that's kind of the buzzword around depression, and there's some truth to that, but we kind of thought long time neurotransmitter deficiency, and they're like, oh no, it's changes to receptor populations of those neurotransmitters in the brain, and we give antidepressants, SSRIs, whatever it is it might be, we're going to bombard that with more neurotransmitters, going to make things better. But what they're really learning is neuroplasticity is really the answer for helping with these aspects. And there is some neuroplasticity that develops when we take antidepressants. There's actually some inflammation that takes place when we take antidepressants. And so I'm not here to say like antidepressants are all bad. There's definitely, like I said, times and places, and that's something you need to talk to a primary care about and work through. But I think there's a lot of other things that can be done in conjunction with. One thing I didn't mention about studies that have been done, most studies on antidepressant medications or for mood disorders are done on very short periods of time. We're talking like 6, 12 weeks, maybe 3 months. People are taking these for years though, and they don't necessarily even know what are the potential long-term consequences of these. I think we do know. I mean, that's where the side effects come from. And so I think it's important that, the research says like, oh, this is all good, but there's the other side of the coin, so to speak. And then another thing that's really trending right now is inflammation as it relates to depression. And some schools of thought are really right now, depression is just a problem with inflammation and high levels of inflammation. If we get the inflammation down, people are going to feel a lot better. And there probably is some truth to all of these here, but it's just a matter of how can we take and not just focus on one particular isolated item. How can we take everything that encompasses being a human being and try and make it all work better? This is a picture from a study I know you can't even read. It says environmental exposures and depression, biological mechanisms, and epidemiological evidence. And I love this because it kind of takes in a lot of things that we're talking about here. And if you can kind of see, there's things in the far periphery here. It says distant context environment. And we have the little pink ring around here. It says proximate contextual environment. And then physical environment is the blue. And then we have all these different aspects of the brain itself. And here in the center, the nodulus area is depression. And so all these things we have, growing urban environments, political system, economy, biodiverse ecosystems, warring conflicts, climate change, disasters, all those things, like I said, those things are happening in our world. And we know, like more than ever, because we're so made aware of it, those things can cause us to have depression and anxiety because that's an external stressor. And so again, sometimes we need to have good coping strategies to know how to work and think through some of those aspects. Same with family and friends and our neighbors and our work. Like those are all relationships that we have, and we need to have those relationships, but we want to have healthy relationships. And so this is where things like counseling can come in very helpful and be good to kind of talk about those interpersonal aspects and how we relate to the world around us. But then we have our direct physical environment. And what was really interesting, I think this is one of the first research papers I've seen talking about pollen as it relates to depression and anxiety. And there's not a lot of research out there, but there is this kind of growing understanding, and this would make sense because we talked about food sensitivities potentially causing the environment or inflammation being produced because of allergenic foods. We could posit the same could happen because of something we're breathing in or being exposed to in the environment as it relates to pollen or air pollution. BPA and phthalates, those are different toxins that are very ubiquitous in our environment. It's hard to avoid it. We've heard microplastics, that's been a big buzzword here recently. That's what we're talking about here. These are all toxic. They're neuroendocrine disruptors, as are pesticides, heavy metals. All those things are toxic to our body. We're always being exposed to them, but can we handle it? That's the question. An interesting one is noise and EMF. They actually did studies that say if you were in an urban area where there's a lot of noise, whether you're like close to a train track or high traffic areas, that literally has an impact on your predisposition towards depression and anxiety. Also interesting, the more of that you're exposed to, the more air pollution generally. And they've actually done studies that show a lot of tie-in to kids as they're growing and developing, being exposed to these things, also having more problems with neurodevelopmental disorders as they go through life. And so it starts when we're kids, but this continues even as we're adults. When we're exposed to these things can be very harmful. I had a patient ask me, she's like, "Are you going to talk about EMF?" And I said, not much, but there's again, a growing body of evidence as there's more EMF exposures, everything from Wi-Fi to cell phones to so many things that are throwing this off, but that there are people who are sensitive to EMF. And the closer you are to those types of things, you're going to potentially have impact. One class I took said, especially if you have mitochondrial issues, you're going to be more likely to have reactions to that EMF. So the other things in here are things we've kind of talked about already, so I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot more. Is neuroplasticity as it relates to inflammation, oxidative stress, neurotransmitters. All those things are, again, integrated here. But I thought that was a really interesting paper. It talked about, it reviewed a lot of different papers that have been written to kind of tie all those things together, and I just love that graphic. So how do we assess the bad mood brain, as we'll call it here? History. Getting somebody's history is a really great way to kind of get an idea, like how did you get here and what's your life looked like. We try and do a comprehensive history. There's certain places you go where you might fill out 20 pages of intake, and sometimes when somebody is dealing with a lot of problems, we need to dive that deep into it. And so there are different types of forms and questionnaires that help to kind of lead us to where we might need to look in addition to, in our case, just doing chiropractic work. An examination is always very helpful. Chiropractic examination involves a lot of looking at posture. It looks at different aspects of subluxation or restriction of movement within the body. We do usually like a cursory neuro exam, but a lot of times what we need is a little bit more of an in-depth neuro exam to look at some of these aspects of brain and function, because we really want to look for what can we work on within the body that doesn't look like it's functioning optimally, and how can we work to stimulate that to function better. Again, what can we do to build resilience? And we're going to talk about how can we kind of stack this positive side here in this last 5-10 minutes, okay? I'm going to fly through some of this because some of it's just going to be review. I'll try and pause on some of the things we haven't talked about so much. So we already talked about what are the things that lead to a healthy environment. And so again, we talked about that immune system, blood sugar, thyroid, different hormones, digestion. I put this in a paper, I put this illustration from a paper, and what it is essentially talking about is the neuroplasticity, what's been researched as it relates to 3 foundational aspects of our health, and that is how we exercise, how we sleep, and our diet. And so what we kind of see here is that exercise, like if you come away with nothing else tonight, if you can exercise, you're going to be a step ahead. That is like first and foremost, if you can exercise, and whatever your capacity is, that's going to be amazing for you, because what they see is aerobic is good, resistance is good for improving neuroplasticity, but what's even better is if you do them in combination, if you have some variation within your workout routines. When we look at sleep, adequate sleep quality, and that of course varies from person to person, but we can see there's definite problems when people are deprived of sleep. So that would be like most people need 7 to 9. So if you're falling with 4 or 5, some people function okay at 6, but we really want to be getting some of this REM sleep, or if you have sleep disorders, and things like sleep apnea are just really, really big in our world today. And so that can be a problem people are dealing with that can be affecting their brain health and brain function. Again, we talked about, like I mentioned, the ketogenic diet, Mediterranean diet, calorie restriction, which is kind of a varied form of the ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting. All those things are talking about different ways we kind of reduce the amount of simple sugars that we're taking in, or the amount of food that we're taking in. And it's amazing how our cells, and our nerve cells particularly, actually have the ability to heal and regulate better at that point. Mediterranean diet is just a diet that's been really well studied for everything from cancer and heart disease to depression and anxiety. And so it is there's a lot of research behind it. There's other good diets out there too, but that's one that's just had a lot of research done on it because of how prevalent it is. So again, we kind of pair that with, say, high calorie diet or high saturated fat or high sugar. Those are all things that are going to, again, tilt us away from positive neuroplasticity and towards negative neuroplasticity, is what this research showed. How can we activate our brain? Well, there's lots of ways to activate our brain. I'm going to give you a list of some here, though. Identification of smells or taste. You take a bite of food and you're like, what's in this food? Whether it's spicing or different things of that nature. Eye movements. Vestibular activation. Vestibular is the system in our inner ear that senses when we move in an angular motion, or if we move forward, back, up, down. And so all of those activations are sending information into our brain and says this is where we are in space and time. And so this is something that when we do chiropractic adjustments is indirectly affected. But there are some ways to actually directly affect just your vestibular system in a positive way. Auditory. When I gave this to the staff last week, we talked about there's different frequencies of beats that activate the brain in different ways. And this is something I know not very much about. But if you do some research and say, I want mood boosting, music, it's amazing. There's plenty of it out there. You can find it in different ways. But actually listening to music can be actually stimulating to our brain in a healthy way. Complex movements is something that we use in chiropractic care, and sometimes we do more linear types of movements, sometimes we do more complex figure 8 infinity types of motions to try and help stimulate brain function in various ways, because of how there's crossover of sensory systems to target more, say, on the right side of the body, the left side of the brain. And so we can do some aspects of complex movements to fire that off. Gargling and singing are ways that we can activate our vagus nerve pathways, and there's other ways to do it too, but that's just kind of some of the easiest ways to do it. Breathing also does. Visualization is a really interesting thing, that you can actually visualize doing something and you fire all the circuitry in the brain other than the descending pathway that goes out to your spinal cord and actually says, all right, I'm going to walk. But you can think about walking and envision yourself walking, and actually fire some of that pathway. And some people are very fragile. That's how you have to start with them. Exercise that activates the brain. I love things like yoga, Pilates, bar. Some of those are kind of an ascending order of intensity, but they're thought to be a little bit more lower impact, and they're focusing a lot on balance and muscle coordination and lengthening. And so those are really great. Balance training is really, really profound for keeping our brain healthy and keeping us healthy as we go through life so we don't fall over and hurt something. When we want to exercise within our metabolic capacity. And what I'll tell you just very briefly about that is when you get done exercising and the day after, you shouldn't feel like that was a mistake. That was a bad idea, what I just did yesterday. Somebody put it to me as, you should be able to, within 24 hours, think, I could do that workout again, and be okay with it. And so that's kind of an idea within your metabolic capacity. You shouldn't feel like you're gonna pass out. You shouldn't feel dizzy. You shouldn't feel lightheaded when you're done exercising. You should feel like you worked out. You might feel a little sore, but it shouldn't feel worse than that. And like we talked about already, it's really integration of multiple different facets of this: weight training, cardiovascular, even something as simple as walking. Like if you're not doing anything, just walking. And there's really great research too about getting out in nature and walking, as opposed to just walking on a neighborhood sidewalk. You have to be careful because there's usually more stumps and squirrels and things like that you could potentially trip over, but it's really great to get out in natural environments, and it helps to stimulate our brain in a better way than if we're walking through more of a urban, suburban environment. I was going to talk to you guys about brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but just know that it's a chemical release in our brain when we exercise, and it does amazing things to help with that connectivity. And along with exercise, releasing serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine to try and help boost those amounts in our brains. We talked about this a little bit already. So again, basic brain nutrition, a little bit more complex. And this turns into what we call like green medicine. And so it's like, well, I can take serotonin, or I can take 5-HT, essentially tryptophan, that will feed into the serotonin pathways, or I can take tyrosine that will lead into these. And for a time, sometimes that can be necessary, but ideally you get to the bottom of why are those issues there to begin with. Turmeric and resveratrol being anti-inflammatory, but they are also help to quench free radicals as well. Glutathione, same thing. Vinpocetine and huperzine are things that help with acetylcholine and also with circulation. And so those are some things that sometimes need to be addressed, that can be addressed to kind of help give people some support. Eat food that is real food, that is good food. You know, real food is really the key word there, though. When you look at ingredients on a package and most of it you don't recognize, then it's probably not food, and it's food-like product, and you generally don't want to be eating it. We can get into things like gut repair programs. Like I said, I did a class on digestive health, and we talked a little about what can we do to help improve the repair of our gut, because that is, like I said, second brain, and has a huge impact on the inflammation levels within our body. We talked about toxin exposures, so detoxification programs that have different supplements that are involved, but both gut repair and detoxification, a lot of times what we're doing is we're taking things away from our diet to try and remove some of that burden from our body. And then we slowly add things back in to see, does my body react in a negative way to these? So those can be really helpful in boosting our resilience and improving our overall health. And we talked very briefly again, calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet are all things that have been researched to help in these respects as well. This was one of Dr. Lindholm's slides I wanted to throw in here because it talks about a lot of the same things I was mentioning, but he threw in here also probiotics, sunshine, getting out, and the sunlight is also really helpful for us. Chiropractic adjustments. We're chiropractors. We haven't talked much about chiropractic, and we're not going to necessarily dive into it a whole lot, but this was a slide from Dr. Lindholm, and this is just tells you, like, this has been in chiropractic's, I don't want to say wheelhouse, but we've been working with this for a long time. This was a multidisciplinary center that was actually associated with the Palmer College back in 1926 to 1961. And so it was a Clearview Sanitarium, and it was essentially people were there treated by a team of doctors, including chiropractors, for nervous and mental disorders. And so this has, again, been something that's been really, we've done a lot with this as chiropractors in the years past, not so much now because there's so many other approaches to it, but I think we need to get back to it as like this is a helpful, not the only treatment, but this is a helpful treatment in trying to fire up mechanoreception and proprioception within the body so that we can help the brain to function more optimally. I love this quote. Dr. Lindholm put this in his. It's from Augustine of Hippo. And really what this gets down to is the heart of the matter, and that is, of course, our mood is important, but our relationship with God is really the most important thing as it relates to how we are going through this life. And a lot of things that we get focused on in the light of eternity and spending the one who we were made for, our hearts were made for you. When we think about that, the things that we are suffering through on this earth sometimes become a little bit less Not to say that they go away, but having God, having Christ as our firm foundation is so important. And it says here, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. It brings to mind a verse that I know. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon yourself and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." And so health is entwined in physical, mental, emotional, but we also believe that there is a spiritual, at least in our office. That's something that's very important to us. And so this is something I didn't want to miss out on. We're not going to talk in a lot more depth about it, but it is such an important thing of knowing our true purpose in life lies, and that is in God. So as we wrap things up here, some people are like, wow, that was a lot. Where do I start? And honestly, the answer I give people is we got to start somewhere, and we got to start somewhere small, generally. And so we have to think about, we can sometimes take a presentation like this and be like, I'm going to do it all. We can't do it all at once. We have to take small actionable steps and say, what can we do today, tomorrow? What's my plan? It's good to have a plan. It's good to kind of think these things out. So many times people are like, I'm going to do GI repair detox tomorrow. I'm like, you need to get prepped for that. You need to have some of the information. You need to know what this looks like. And so I encourage you, talking to your provider, and say, what are some things I could potentially do based on some of the aspects of the presentation we talked about here tonight. The biggest things we can think about, though, and I'll just leave you with this, is how we move, how we eat, and how we think. And so if you're not moving, start moving. That might be as simple as a walk. That might be as simple as doing some chair arm exercises. It's just doing something, getting your body moving and engaging your brain as you do it. Making eating choices that are going to be helpful for building your body up, rather than contributing building blocks that are poor quality and are going to lead to its disrepair and tearing down. And then how you think. What are we going to focus our minds on? Is it the bad? There's so much bad in the world. We need to focus on the good. We need to focus on the positive. Like I said, we need to focus on Christ. Those are the things that are going to see us through these days. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for sitting with me through it. I hope I didn't put you to sleep too often. So